So welcome back to another episode of NeuroPsyQ. A few lectures and episodes ago, we took a dive into the histological features of diffuse gliomas, specifically glioblastoma. Today we follow up on that and investigate some of the molecular events that are driving these tumors. We're joined today by one of my colleagues and good friends, Dr. Andrew Gao, who will give us again an overview of the genetic events that are thought to lead to both aggressive and more indolent types of brain tumors. So sit back, enjoy, and hopefully it's an educational episode into these very important types of neurological conditions.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of NeuroPsyQ. Today we'll be focusing on a clinical topic, the molecular classification of a group of brain tumors known as diffuse gliomas. Systematic attempts at brain tumor classification have been going on for almost a century, starting with Bailey and Cushing's seminal work in 1926. In the introduction to their work, they wrote about the dismal state of brain tumor classification in their day. Quote, "The impression prevails in both laboratory and clinic that the microscopical examination of a specimen removed at operation will not serve to predict, with any degree of certainty, the future course of development of a brain tumor." And they continued, "The existing classifications have served to do little more than add confusion to a complicated subject." Bailey and Cushing based their system on newly developed histochemical techniques to visualize the morphology of different cell types, and they relied on Cohnheim's theory of tumor development, which hypothesized that tumor cells develop from embryonic rests. Thus, Bailey and Cushing created their classification by comparing the morphologic features of tumor cells with that of normal cells at defined stages of histogenesis. Ultimately, they developed this classification of 14 different types of gliomas, and in this schematic, each tumor type is written under their respective putative embryonic precursor. For example, Bailey and Cushing posited that the medullary epithelium develops into the primitive spongioblast, which develops into the ependymal spongioblast, and finally ependyma. Thus, tumors resembling and arising from those cell types are classified as medulloepithelioma, neuroepithelioma, ependymoblastoma, and ependymoma, respectively. Unfortunately, there were several issues with this system. First, their histogenesis is essentially a hypothetical construction and not necessarily how we understand CNS embryology today. The different stages of histogenesis were difficult to recognize based on morphology alone, and thus this system was difficult to apply consistently. However, Bailey and Cushing asked three important questions relating to the principles of a classification system. What is the basis of the structural variability shown by these gliomatous tumors? Has their histologic variation any clinical significance? And does it account for the unexpectedly long survival period, or even cure, after extirpating certain of them? If we reframe these questions into a more modern context, then we can ask a similar set of questions. Firstly, what should be the basis of tumor classification? Does the classification system yield distinct clinical pathological entities? And what should be the basis of grading or predicting clinical behavior? The Bailey and Cushing system persisted to the late 1940s and early 1950s. The next advance was contributed by Kernahan, who was more famous for his notch. He simplified the classification system into 5 types: astrocytoma, ependymoma, oligodendroglioma, what he called neuroastrocytoma, and medulloblastoma. He was operating under the theory that tumors arise from terminally differentiated cells that undergo different degrees of dedifferentiation. Thus, in contrast to Bailey and Cushing, where, for example, there were several types of astrocytoma, Kernahan recognized that they were the same type of tumor with differing degrees of dedifferentiation. Or another way of putting it is that the more dedifferentiated a tumor is, the more anaplasia it has. Thus, Kernahan developed a 4-tiered grading system based on the degree of histologic anaplasia to try to predict biological behavior. Subsequent to Kernighan, several others also developed histologic grading system, including Ringert's and the St. Anne Mayo system, either 3-tiered or 4-tiered. However, grade was and is a contentious issue, with more clinically focused colleagues preferring a malignancy scale, or a system that emphasizes how a tumor will behave clinically. While this was not unrelated to histologic grade, it did create a few differences. For example, in the system proposed by Zulk, grade 0 were extraaxial tumors that could be completely resected, such as meningioma, although a malignant meningioma would then jump to grade 3. Likewise, pinealomas, what we would today call pineocytomas, while histologically bland, are grade 3 due to their problematic location. The first World Health Organization classification system came out in 1979 and tried to harmonize these various issues, and since then has become the definitive classification system. We're now in the 4th revised edition, published in 2016, with the 5th edition expected later this year in 2020. The WHO grading system, summarized on this slide, attempts to integrate both histologic and clinical aspects, and can be used to compare the degree of malignancy both across tumor entities and within a specific tumor type, and to give a sense of prognosis and influence the choice of therapy. Thus we come to the classification scheme used in the previous edition of the WHO book, published in 2007. Obviously, not all tumors are listed here, but just the ones that will become relevant to our discussion. You'll see that the tumors are still mainly classified by the type of cell they resemble, for instance astrocytic or oligodendroglial, and they are assigned a grade, here in brackets. Some of these tumors show a diffusely infiltrating pattern of growth, and we'll start by discussing those. Diffusely infiltrating astrocytomas in the 2007 scheme are listed as diffuse, anaplastic, and glioblastoma, and progress from grades 2 to 4. P53 mutations were known to be common in the lower grades, while diffuse astrocytoma, WHO grade 2, was characterized by slow growth and progression. It invariably transformed to glioblastoma, although the time to do so was highly variable, ranging from 1 year to greater than 10 years. Glioblastomas that arose from transformed lower grade tumors were called secondary GBM, but this was far less common than those that arose de novo, or primary GBM. While it was beginning to be recognized that there was likely a molecular difference between primary and secondary GBM, note that the molecular alterations listed here are the same 5 genetic alterations, only differing in frequency, not type. Oligodendroglioma was defined as an infiltrating glioma that resembled oligodendrocytes with round nuclei and perinuclear halos. This was one of the first tumors to have an identified molecular alteration, combined deletion of chromosome arms 1p and 19q. This resulted from an unbalanced translocation and subsequent loss of the derivative chromosome. Under the 2007 scheme, this occurred in about 80% of oligos. Then there was the category of Oligoastrocytoma, a mixed tumor resembling both astrocytoma and oligodendroglioma. Likewise, it sometimes showed 1p19q co-deletion and sometimes p53 mutation, usually in mutually exclusive fashion. Many theories arose regarding this enigmatic tumor, including origin from bipotential glial precursors or their morphology being dependent on location. Ultimately, according to the WHO book, the biological basis of these two distinct glial types remains to be elucidated. Interestingly enough, some pathologists avoided this diagnosis and tried their best to categorize a tumor into either astrocytoma or oligodendroglioma, whereas others frequently made this diagnosis since they couldn't be wrong. Several questions arise from the 2007 classification. For example, how soon will diffuse astrocytoma transform into GBM? According to the WHO book, there is currently no validated factor that ambiguously predicts in individual patients whether and how soon malignant progression is likely to occur. P53 mutations were not shown to be a predictor of outcome, and some studies found that a shorter time interval before progression in P53 mutant cases. Thus, a range from 1 year to more than 10 years is not comforting to either the treating physician or the patient. How do we distinguish histologically between astrocytoma, oligodendroglioma, and oligoastrocytoma? Well, according to the WHO book, the pronounced phenotypic heterogeneity of astrocytic and oligodendroglial lineages and our lack of reliable markers make it difficult to define diagnostic criteria. In patients enrolled into clinical trials, where their tumors were subsequently independently reviewed, it was apparently, quote, safe to assume that 20 to 30% of gliomas were reclassified. Moreover, the highly variable rates of 1p19q codeletion among entities in various studies were likely due to the widely differing diagnostic criteria. Here we see the distribution of molecular alterations between tumor types, while oligo shows the most frequent 1p19q codeletion, and p53 mutation is usually in astrocytomas. They were not understood in 2007 to be exclusive to either tumor type, and of course oligoastrocytoma was a mix of both. Can the histologic diagnosis guide treatment? In fact, it was the presence of 1p19q codeletion that correlated with a specific response to PCV chemotherapy. Furthermore, in large phase 3 clinical trials of histologically defined anaplastic oligodendroglioma, it was 1p19q codeletion that was the main prognostic and predictive factor. And as it turned out, it was later discovered that 30% of these tumors enrolled in these trials were in fact glioblastoma. And so this was the state of affairs before the beginning of the molecular era of brain tumor classification, which decisively began in 2008. 2008 marked the discovery of mutations in isocitrate dehydrogenase, or IDH, in secondary GBM initially, and then subsequently in a large proportion of the lower grade gliomas, astrocytoma, oligodendroglioma, and oligoastrocytoma. IDH mutant tumors were soon recognized to have a far superior prognosis compared to IDH-wildtype, so much so that IDH mutant GBMs were better than IDH-wildtype anaplastic astrocytomas, even though the former has a higher histologic grade. IDH-wildtype tumors were shown to commonly have the molecular alterations of a primary glioblastoma. ATRX mutations were then discovered in IDH mutant astrocytomas in 2011 and were shown to be mutually exclusive with 1p19q codeletion. Oligoastrocytomas, rather than having a mixed genotype, could in fact be segregated into either astrocytoma or oligodendroglioma based on the presence or absence of 1p19q codeletion or ATRX and p53 mutation. This large study from the New England Journal of Medicine in 2015 looked at comprehensively characterized lower-grade gliomas. You can see that the survival curves stratified by histologic class and grade showed some separation, with grade 2 in dashed lines and grade 3 in solid, but overall not a huge difference when compared by type. In contrast, when stratified by molecular subgroup, the clinical significance becomes much more obvious. Low-grade gliomas with IDH mutation and 1p19q codeletion, shown in purple, i.e. oligodendrogliomas, showed the best prognosis, followed by IDH mutant non-codeleted astrocytomas. Glioblastoma with IDH mutation is better than without, but more strikingly, low-grade gliomas that were IDH wild-type showed similar prognosis to glioblastoma, and many other publications from around this time also emphasize the poor prognosis associated with IDH status. Thus, we have reconceptualized our understanding of gliomas. essentially based on the discovery of only two molecular markers, IDH mutation and ATRX. Diffuse gliomas likely have a common origin given that they share IDH mutations, and then they can be separated into astrocytoma or oligodendroglioma based on their molecular characteristics. Astrocytoma may then progress to anaplastic astrocytoma or glioblastoma. This roughly corresponds to the legacy concept of secondary GBM, but is not identical, as an IDH mutant GBM can in fact arise de novo, but would still carry the superior prognosis compared to IDH wildtype. In contrast, IDH wildtype GBM roughly corresponds to the legacy concept of primary GBM, but as we saw previously, lower-grade gliomas that are IDH wildtype behave similarly to GBM and likely represent an earlier, albeit brief, stage of IDH wildtype GBM development. So in the 2016 classification, the histologic subtypes of astrocytoma, oligoastrocytoma, and oligodendroglioma can be stratified by IDH status and then by 1p19q codeletion. In fact, the diagnosis of oligodendroglioma now requires the demonstration of IDH mutation and 1p19q codeletion, while ATRX and p53 mutations are supportive features of astrocytoma. Likewise, GBM is also separated into the IDH mutant and IDH wildtype categories. The category of IDH wildtype lower-grade glioma was included as a provisional entity based on the findings that IDH wildtype lower-grade gliomas had such a terrible prognosis, but we shall return to this concept later. So for the diffuse gliomas, we've clarified the relationship of lower-grade glioma or lower-grade astrocytoma to glioblastoma. We've redefined oligodendroglioma to be based on the presence of IDH mutation in 1p19q codeletion, and we've eliminated the ambiguous category of oligoastrocytoma, all based on molecular discoveries. In parallel to these developments in the adult tumor world, histone mutations were discovered in 2012 in pediatric high-grade gliomas. Diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, which was a clinical pathological term referring to infiltrative astrocytomas typically within the pons in children, was found to frequently harbor histone H3.3 or 3.1 K27M mutations, and this was associated with a dismal prognosis compared to histone wild-type. Subsequent studies showed diffuse gliomas in other midline locations, such as the spinal cord or thalamus, also frequently harbored K27M mutations, including in adults, and a new entity known as diffuse midline glioma, H3K27M mutant, WHO grade 4, was created. Notably, these tumors are WHO grade 4 regardless of histologic grade. In contrast to midline locations, histone 3.3 G34R or V mutations were found in hemispheric high-grade gliomas, typically in teens and younger adults. Thus, another change is the addition of a new entity, diffuse midline glioma, H3K27M mutant, WHO grade 4. The 2016 scheme now reorganizes these tumors by recognizing the similarity between the diffusely infiltrating gliomas based on their shared molecular features and separating the diffuse astrocytomas from the circumscribed ones, for example. One issue that the 2016 classification did not specifically address is IDH wildtype lower-grade glioma in fact a distinct category? The literature up to that point strongly emphasized the inferior prognosis of tumors lacking IDH mutation. But conceptually, what sense does it make to categorize a tumor based on the absence of a feature, such as IDH wildtype? Just as non-small cell lung cancer and non-Hodgkin lymphoma were perhaps at one point useful concepts in a particular context, they are heterogeneous categories composed of a diverse array of entities. Are IDH wildtype lower-grade gliomas similar in that way? As stated before, the poor prognosis of IDH wildtype gliomas has been a point of emphasis in the literature up to this point. However, a subset of IDH wildtype diffuse gliomas in fact do not carry a worse prognosis than IDH mutant tumors. And over time, it has become recognized that the IDH wildtype category is in fact a heterogeneous collection of different tumors. In this study, a significant proportion of IDH wildtype lower-grade gliomas had what the authors referred to as molecular low-grade features. In particular, alterations in MIB were associated with a particularly good prognosis. Over the past few years, there have been several non-IDH molecular alterations associated with good prognosis, which have collectively been referred to as quote-unquote pediatric-type. They commonly occur in low-grade diffuse gliomas of childhood, but not exclusively so, and may occur in younger adults. These alterations are technically IDH wildtype, but they show relatively indolent behavior, they do not invariably progress to a higher grade, and show a diverse array of molecular alterations that commonly affect the MAP kinase pathway as illustrated here. The pediatric-type diffuse gliomas listed here, several of which were described very recently, in fact overlap substantially from both a histologic and molecular perspective with other common pediatric tumors, such as the circumscribed astrocytomas or the glioneuronal tumors. Again, the common drivers are typically members of the MAP kinase pathway or other related pathways. Therefore, IDH wildtype is a clinically and molecularly heterogeneous category. In between WHO book updates, a group known as the Consortium to Inform Molecular and Practical Approaches to CNS Tumor Taxonomy, not official WHO, or C-IMPACTNOW for short, have been tasked with providing practical updates in brain tumor diagnosis and classification. A summary of the recommendations relating to diffuse gliomas is shown here. The earlier studies that showed poor prognosis of IDH wild-type tumors were those that were the molecular equivalent of a glioblastoma. Specifically, the diagnosis can now be made by demonstrating one of EGFR amplification, TER promoter mutation, or combined chromosome 7 gain and 10 loss. This new entity has been termed diffuse astrocytic glioma with molecular features of glioblastoma and is automatically assigned a WHO grade 4. In contrast, tumors with pediatric-type molecular alterations are listed here. Notably, a grade has not been assigned or recommended for these diagnoses. Some tumors in this category are quite indolent and may correspond in fact to WHO grade 1, but traditionally the lowest grade assigned to diffuse gliomas has been 2. Other tumors in this category, while overall having good prognosis, may be at risk of high-grade transformation, creating yet another uncertainty. Lastly, for completeness, the other category of IDH wild-type glioma would be the histone group listed at the bottom. Thus, to summarize, since the 2016 edition, IDH wild-type lower-grade gliomas is in fact a heterogeneous collection of entities and should be further classified. How will our classification change in the future edition? In some ways, with respect to the pediatric-type tumors, we are in a position that we had previously been in with astrocytoma, oligodendroglioma, and oligoastrocytoma in 2007. There are clearly a group of tumors with similar clinical and pathological features and similar molecular alterations, but how exactly are they related to each other, and do they truly represent unique entities, or can they be unified based on molecular features? Lastly, we will briefly discuss the use of molecular alterations to predict behavior. That is, can it be used in the grading of tumors, and if so, is it better than traditional histology? We have already seen examples where the finding of a particular alteration defines the grade, regardless of the histologic grade. For example, histone K27M mutation is an automatic grade 4, and if a tumor demonstrates the molecular features of a GBM, then it is also grade 4. There's also the possibility that additional molecular features can modulate the grade within a certain entity. For example, this study investigated the role of several histologic and molecular features in grading IDH mutant astrocytomas and found that the traditional criteria of mitotic activity and microvascular proliferation were not in fact associated with outcome. Notably, necrosis, CDKN2A homozygous deletion, or high copy number variability were found to be useful for grading. Interestingly, just as I was preparing this presentation, C-IMPACTNOW published an update addressing this particular issue, and they have stated that, quote, legacy grading systems are not optimal. Instead, they have adopted a combined molecular histologic approach for IDH mutant astrocytoma. The old system of mitotic activity, microvascular proliferation, and necrosis can still be used, but now CDKN2A homozygous deletion is a criterion by itself for WHO grade 4. To summarize, molecular classification has significantly refined our traditional histologic classification. Molecular alterations can predict biologic behavior and refines traditional histologic grading. And ongoing discoveries help to define distinct clinical pathological entities with prognostic and therapeutic complications. If you've made it to the end of this presentation, congratulations and thank you.
So there you have it, the molecular basis of brain tumors and specifically gliomas. Hope that was informative, and we'll continue with these educational lectures on brain tumors and other neurological disorders. See you next time.